Hey, Emily,
Hey, Stephanie.
you want to do a podcast?
Absolutely. Welcome to Cycle Chats, a podcast that destigmatizes what it means to be a woman. This is episode 5, Connection Counseling New York, with a licensed marriage and family therapist living her best life in New York City. Let's welcome to the podcast, Erica. What made you get into this field?
I've always loved psychology from like high school and from before. I've always known that I wanted to do it. So it was kind of like a no-brainer when I went to college that that was going to be my major. But when you go to grad school, like there's so many different fields of it and so many different studies of it. And I knew that I wanted to do marriage and family, or I always felt like connected to it. At the time, I was in a relationship and I drew a lot of, I guess, like happiness and just support from that area of my life. And then in grad school, I decided we got engaged. And so when I was in grad school, that's when I really solidified that I wanted to work with couples. I just felt so connected to the stuff that I was learning when it came to like couples work and relationship. And I love everything like romance and love. And so it just felt like a good fit for me. So I was just felt connected to the work and at that stage of my life already at the time. And so everything just really resonated with me.
You're a very romantic person. Is there anything specifically in your childhood that made you so romantic?
I think my parents, like they were always very affectionate with each other, really loving, even to the point where like, I guess like when you watch TV shows and you see like those parents that are always like kissing or like touching each other and it's like gross to see it. But I think even if it is like kind of, it was like, oh my gosh, like stop. On some level, I really enjoyed seeing them being so like affectionate and loving because I think it provided a sense of security and just like safety to know that they were very solid in that way. And just like, you know, like growing up as a girl, when we watch like these movies and these shows and they're catered to like relationships and, you know, finding that special someone. And so, yeah, I've just always been connected to it and I really loved like that genre. Like rom-coms are my favorite type of movies.
I am a huge rom-com fan, and they are what I watch when I'm like on my period or I'm feeling sad. No matter how many times I watch Runaway Bride, it's not enough. I could watch it one more time. And that card scene, I mean, slap me with a feather and hold me down. Is there one that you specifically like?
10 Things I Hate About You is like one of my favorites. I really, really love that one.
Yes, Heath Ledger singing on those bleachers.
I want to swing it back over because it's interesting, Erica, that you talk about your parents being affectionate with one another. I feel that there's a common misconception, or so I feel that I've grown up with, that when people get older, that that's not an important part of your relationship. Do you find that that's something the couples that you counsel struggle with as they age into their relationship with one another?
I think that it just differs on what it would look like or what it does look like when you first get into a relationship, which is like very new. There's so much like hormones going on and so much adrenaline and just like lust for one another. So naturally you're just more drawn to each other. So it looks like right, like you want to spend so much time with them, like you're always on them and, you know, having sex like in the beginning and that being so new and exciting. And as time goes on, there's like more comfort, right? Like there's more of a friendship, feel more yourself with them. And so it kind of dwindles or it just doesn't look the same. And so I think because of that, when you're comparing, right, like the beginning of the relationship to, let's say, when you're like 5 years in or 10 years in, it just looks so much different in terms of affection.
What do you find is some of the biggest issues you run into with couples, especially in this day and age, the world as it is now?
Yeah. So 9 times out of 10 couples will come to my office and the number one concern they'll talk about wanting to fix or just like talk about is their communication. So the way that they talk about things, the way that they argue, and really wanting to hone that in to feel understood by one another, to feel seen by each other, and to minimize the way that they're fighting with each other. I think given COVID and what's been going on now and people working in the same space, it's probably even more heightened, or they just feel more overwhelmed by that, right? Like where they're always around each other. And so maybe the quality time piece has been coming up more where they feel like, you know, one partner will feel like, you know, we haven't spent a lot of time together, a lot of intentional time together, where the other person will feel like, well, you know, I'm with you all the time and we're around each other all the time. So like, to me, it feels as though we have been spending a lot of time together and I need a break. And so balancing what that looks like and balancing the time spent that's intentional and true couples time versus just being around each other and knowing what that looks like in terms of individual time versus couple time, because individual time is also important and it's a vital part of the relationship, right? Like just because we're together and we're a couple and we live together doesn't necessarily mean that I want to be around you 24/7 or that it's healthy to be around you 24/7. It's okay to take breaks from each other and to do our own thing. But I think if that hasn't been discussed or really talked about, it can look and feel like rejection or, you know, like I don't want to be around you versus it just meaning it has nothing to do with the partner or the other person and more to do with just myself, right? Like let's say for me, like I'm an introvert and so I enjoy having my alone time and spending time by myself and like reading and recouping in that way. But it doesn't mean that I don't also enjoy spending time with my partner. I just want to feel more balanced. And for a lot of people, they've been really having a challenge in terms of what that looks like and being able to create that balance in their relationship right now.
Yeah, I was just going to say that was a huge thing for my husband and I at the beginning of this. It was a few months of us trying to figure out how this works because, of course, he was working from home and I wasn't used to having him work and I wanted him to be around me because then I was unemployed. And I was like, why am I spending all day on the couch alone? Like, you're right upstairs and you're not doing anything. And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm working. And I was like, no, you're not. For us, it was really difficult because it was trying to balance that work life situation because never have we worked in the same house, 24/7. It's been a learning process, but it's been a really great learning process for us. We were taking our dog for a walk the other day and we thinking about our relationship and how much it's changed over these 5 years. And I wouldn't have it any other way. It has had its ups, it has had its downs, but I know that I have a good partner in him. That's just the best. So if you're able to work it out and even deal with these struggles that nobody was expecting 2020 would bring, I think it's just going to make you a stronger couple for it.
And I agree. I think that when you're able to sort of create that balance and be able to communicate like what's going on, what your needs are and expectations, and just put it all out on the table, it really does make you stronger and you feel more connected afterwards. And being able to create that balance it feels really good when you're able to feel like, okay, like we're on the same page, we're seeing each other, we understand where the person is coming from, and we feel like we're meeting each other where we need to meet each other. That feels so good to be able to connect in that way.
Sounds healthy. That's, I think, a healthy way of behaving. Something I often hear in just in girl conversation, woman conversation, is sometimes you'll hear, oh, fighting's totally normal, which, it is. To disagree with somebody is normal. Obviously, intense fighting all the time is not. But something interesting I've always found is when couples say, we never disagree about anything. I'm like, well, someone's not speaking up then. Disagreement's part of a relationship. And you mentioned that communication, how we communicate with one another and resolve problems. That's kind of the gold right there. Is your relationship, the communication, healthy enough so that you can have disagreements without it turning into this, for the lack of a better word, a pissing match and you guys getting in each other's faces?
And absolutely. I think that is the goal, being able to talk through disagreements and understand that's normal. Like, of course, you're going to have disagreements. You're your own person with your own background, with your own like family history and way of growing up. And then someone else is coming in, and you're joining a relationship with someone else who has a completely different way of viewing life, a completely different perspective of how they grew up and how they view the world. It's natural that you're going to have differences, right? Like, you're going to look at life differently. And the way that you talk about it and discuss it and feel like, okay, this is where I'm coming from, this is where you're coming from. Like, how do we meet in the middle? How do we sort of make it work? Or what do we create for our own family? That is sort of the pinnacle of being able to move through those disagreements, because they are normal and they're natural to have them happen and it's expected. But exactly, you don't want it to feel like when we do disagree, though, that it's always this intense fight, or that we feel like we're not being respected or being heard, or that we're not getting anywhere. It's just us leaving and feeling very separated and isolated from each other.
When would you suggest that a couple seek some counsel?
I'm a huge advocate for therapy, obviously. So I honestly feel that all couples at some point in the relationship should go to therapy, even if there's not like intense sort of things coming up, just because it does really create or help you sort of create a toolbox in terms of the way that you communicate with each other and having really good ways of communicating with each other. But also just for the fact that while you're in therapy, you're going to learn so much about yourself and the way that you show up in your relationship, the things that are triggering for you that you might have not noticed, the things that are, let's say, like annoying from your partner that really aren't about them. It's more about you and your upbringing. And so I think that alone is so invaluable, what you learn about yourself, what you learn about your partner through just like witnessing them talking about their family or their upbringing or whatever. But most people will come in, let's say, even during times where they're not an intense period for them. So let's say like if they're about to get married and they want to feel like, we want to talk about kids or like finances and things like that in a space that feels safe or feels like it's neutral. But most people will come in or feel like it's time to come to therapy when they're fighting a lot, right? Like when it feels very intense or where they're not feeling heard or understood, or they're at the brink sometimes of breaking up, which is not necessarily too late for them to come at that point. But I do think that it is more you sort of come into therapy when it feels like, we're just feeling a shift right now. We feel like we're going through an adjustment period, or we know that this period that we're about to go into is going to be an adjustment period. And maybe being able to talk through what that's going to be like or what our expectations are in therapy will feel helpful or allow us to be able to move through this adjustment period in a way that feels good for the both of us, instead of it feeling like we're jumping in and expecting the best, but not really knowing what it's going to look like.
I have to ask, because you said you're an introvert. So when you are having disagreements with your your partner, you like alone time. My partner is very much that way. I am more of the school of thought of let's rip the band-aid off. Let's talk about it right now. Spill your heart out to me. So that's how I guess my language. For someone like myself who has a partner who needs that alone time, what advice could you give to I guess a more extroverted partner when their introverted partner has to take some time to figure out their issues, what communicating? What can you give for the extroverts that don't quite know how to balance that?
So a lot of times, like, and even when couples come in, like, they'll talk about, let's say, things feeling intense, or like the disagreements will get really high. And there is one person, let's say, sometimes where they'll feel like, okay, at some point, I feel myself getting to, you're talking about him just wanting like to separate because he's, he's feeling introverted or he wants to kind of like take a break. Sometimes it'll look like the person is getting so upset or they feel themselves getting way upset and they don't really want to cross a boundary, right? Or get to a point where they feel like I'm saying things that I don't want to, I'm feeling myself getting really heated. So I want to take a break because of that. But in both times, it's difficult for the other person because let's say, like you're saying, that you want to be able to talk through it and just like fix it, get to a place where you guys are understanding each other, but the other person is having a really hard time just like managing what's coming up for them and their feelings and expressing them. So what I would say in those situations is just to allow them to take the break, right? Like allow them to sort of take the time that they need to, but for you guys to have sort of a game plan around how long that is. So maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 15. And when you guys are in that break, are you like the sort of things that you're thinking about or things that you could have done better, and having a game plan around, like, even though we're taking time apart, it's not like we're just taking time apart and we're doing our own things. Sometimes it might look like that if the person is very heightened and they need to kind of relax. They're doing things to self-soothe or to calm themselves down. So when they come back, they're in a better headspace. But sometimes if they just want a break to kind of decompress and like it was feeling overwhelming, maybe it might feel comforting for you to know, like, okay, even though he's over there, he's taking a break, we're both thinking about, okay, what is it that we want? What is it that we wish that we would have heard from the other person? What is it that we want to convey to them? And really assess, like, what could have been better? And thinking about that in that way. And then when you guys do come together after the time that you've allotted for yourself, it feels a little bit more productive. But maybe for you, it might feel also helpful to know that it's not going to be this indefinite period of like, he's taking a break, but I don't know when he's going to come back. I don't know if we're going to ever really talk about this, especially if he doesn't want to talk about it or it's a lot to talk about it. So I think having a plan around it and knowing that they are going to come back and we are going to end up discussing it can feel really helpful to the other person.
It sounds like you're saying just meet in the middle, have that discussion to say, okay, after 10, 15, whatever, and let's try to adhere to that. And I think that's important for most couples to find common ground. You have your language, they have theirs. And then as a couple, I think you share a language that works for both of you.
So what I'm hearing is compromise is really important. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't want to admit. They want it, especially if they're stubborn, like some of us are. They don't want to admit that they maybe were wrong or, have it their way, because I love my mother and I love my father, but their relationship was not healthy. They finally got a divorce when I was in high school, thankfully. But there was a lot of stubbornness there with my mom and with my dad, and both of their viewpoints. And it's something that I am working so hard on not doing in my relationship, because what I've realized, I guess, through quarantine, because what do you have to do but think, and have thought so much about how my parents' relationship influenced my own. The dishes are a huge thing for my husband and I. I hate dirty dishes in the sink. If they are not clean by the minute that they're put in there, I cannot handle it. But he needs some time to be able to do them. So he likes to do them in the morning. So at the beginning of quarantine, what would happen is that I would do the dishes and then I would take out my resentment on him later. And he was like, but you're not even giving me a chance to do the dishes. I need you to let me do the dishes. So I'm constantly learning, and it's gotten so much better. And I am proud of myself. I can pat myself on the back, and my husband thinks so too, that I let the dirty dishes sit in the sink overnight and he does them in the morning. So compromise is so big. And it's also learning from what your parents did and maybe picking up the things that you liked and dropping the things that you didn't like about them. And I think that's everybody, right? Everybody is just trying to be a better version of themselves. But that's where I think therapy is so amazing, because it's this third person that's able to bring light to situations that maybe you can't see for yourself.
Yeah, and I think that for a lot of us, like when we're able to like sit there and reflect and realize like, oh my gosh, I'm being my mom right now, like, oh my gosh, I'm being my dad right now. It's like a jarring experience to realize that, right? Like, especially when growing up, like let's say for me, I grew up and felt like my mom was like so domineering at times and so critical. And then to realize that, oh my gosh, I'm doing those things. In some ways, it allows you to sort of have more, I guess, like compassion for them and recognize that or understand them from a different perspective when you're in that situation and you recognize that you're showing up in that way, right? Like, or that's what's coming out of you too. You can see like, oh, I can see why she was frustrated when, you know, she came home from work and like we hadn't touched the dishes, but we were just tired or we wanted to hang around and play or whatever. But I think it's the first step is like you being able to recognize, like you're saying, that you were able to reflect when your partner talked about it and you felt like, wow, like that's such a my mom thing. And being able to have that awareness is huge to be able to change it and recognize, like you're saying, dropping the things that we don't like or that we don't want to sort of continue on from our parents and instead adopting things that we did like and then expanding on that and creating like our own sort of version of that with our relationship. So yeah, like I'm proud of you that you were able to reflect on that and recognize like, okay, the dishes aren't that big of a deal, right? Like it's okay for me to leave them. If I want him to help, I can't dictate how he's supposed to help me with it, and kind of let him do his own thing and compromise on that.
Thank you. Well, I have been to therapy when my parents got divorced. That was like a big thing. And then also that was in high school. I was also in my first relationship where I had had sex, and it was a really terrible, emotionally abusive relationship. So it was a really big change and something that I grew to love. It teaches you so much about yourself, where I am, of course, always still growing every day, which is amazing. But I can now realize things about myself much more so than I didn't realize before.
Yeah, that reflection piece I think it's amazing when you're able to do that, when you're able to sit there and like realize like, oh, okay, this is where this is coming from. This is what I'm doing, or this is why this thing is really bothering me. I think it's such a game changer in terms of how we show up and just like us learning about ourselves and knowing ourselves more when we're able to reflect and realize the way why we're doing the things that we're doing and where they're really stemming from, rather than feeling like we're just reacting to things and not really reflecting and understanding and having insights to what's actually going on for us.
I'm reading a book called Mind and Emotions. It's a universal treatment for emotional disorders, but there's a couple things in it that I'm actually peeling through as we're speaking. We talk about, acknowledging our emotions, acknowledging maybe something is wrong, that the way that we are coping might not be so healthy. I just, out of curiosity, what is your take on when we avoid emotions? Because I know the different types of avoidance. There's like cognitive avoidance, protective avoidance, somatic avoidance, all that. What do you find you come across the most with couples trying to avoid their problems?
Yeah, I think that those are often like the harder couples for me, right? Like when I feel like they're coming in and they know that something is going on, or they know that they're not in the best space, but for whatever reason they're having a hard time being able to like vocalize that, right? Like or even admit that even to me, right? Like they're coming to me into therapy to be able to work through what's going on for them. But then each week they're saying like, well, this week was good or nothing was really going on. And the avoidance piece I think is if they're doing it with me, because therapy is basically and what's happening in the room is just a snippet of what's really happening within the relationship. So if they're doing it with me, I know they're doing it with each other, right? Like where they're either not voicing what's really going on, they're avoiding disagreements to just maintain the status quo or sort of maintain this idea that things are fine and that they're fine, even though might not actually be the case, where they're sad, right? Like where they're feeling neglected or they're feeling rejected, but have a fear of being able to bring that up and what that's really going to uncover. And for some couples, that's what it looks like. They feel scared that if we really talk about it and say what's actually going to go on, then what does that mean? Like, what does it mean about our relationship? What does it mean about us? And then they have this fear of the worst case scenario being, and the consequences of that being, what if we separate, or what if we're not able to really handle what that means, and what if it uncovers that we're not compatible, or all these different things and all these different fears. So rather than sort of facing that, or they don't feel ready to face that, they'll avoid it, right? Like they'll eat up their emotions, they'll ignore them and just not talk about them until they feel like they have no other option to, which is what happens when they're in disagreements and they don't really have as much of a filter, or they're not as regulated, right? Like, or their emotions are super heightened. So it's very hard to be able to be mindful of what you're saying and the way that you're saying it, because you're just, really, really heightened. And so they'll say things that have been, eating at them, or they'll be feeling that they've been avoiding talking about when they feel more calm and when things are fine, because they're avoiding it. And so when they're in disagreements, these things will come up, but the way that they're coming out is not nice, right? Like they're not saying it in the best way. They're not really voicing what they're feeling like in the most positive way or the most healthy way. And so it's worse when you're avoiding it and when you're pushing down your emotions, because they end up coming out, but just not in the way that you want them to, or not in the way that you intended them to.
And it's not even self-love, Steph. I think it's self reflection. It's being able to look in and say, what are like the other day, you and I had the conversation, Steph, of like what our greatest attributes are, three greatest, and then our three worst. And you and I we had to think about it. But it's knowing those things about yourself so that you can reflect and say, okay, well, I know this about me. And now how do I change it in this situation?
Yeah, and also being able to, when you're doing that self-reflection, right, like there are going to be parts of you that feel or that are coming up that you feel like you don't like, right, like or that do remind you of like your parents or other people that you feel like, I don't like that trait, or I really, it makes me feel, I feel like it's a dark trait, or I don't really like resonate with it. I wish that I wasn't like that. And being able to look at those parts of yourself and not judge yourself for them, right, like they're there for a reason. There's a reason why that sort of came up, or you were, coping in some way by using that skill or that trait or whatever. And although maybe at this point in your life, it's not necessary anymore, it's not really serving the purpose that you need it to anymore, being able to reflect and like thank yourself, or not looking at yourself with judgment or with critical eyes, that part of you was there at one point. Because there's a reason why that came up, and you've been able to grow from that, right? Like, or reflect that that's not something that you want to be anymore, or it's not the way that you want to show up anymore, which is okay.
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest thing that you can do for yourself and for your partner, or, your loved ones, that it's just you acknowledging yourself and the things that maybe you need to work on. That's huge.
I think it's so wonderful that there are people such as yourself who have taken the time to really assess that this doesn't mean that your relationship is in peril, but rather that you're taking a proactive step, and that this is a healthy thing to do, even for couples who don't feel like they're, because I hear that a lot. Oh, we don't have any problems, but it's okay. Even if you go, it opens your eyes to maybe something little that could build up to be bigger. I just have to say thank you that, I'm a big mental health advocate, and I love all types of psychology and just what goes into the mind. It's so powerful.
So what advice do you have for couples that are having this trouble communicating? Is it really just sitting down with somebody like yourself, or is there like a tip or trick that they can do at home?
I think for a lot of couples, it could be like coming into therapy and having someone else be there and being able to sort of like walk them through it and really experience what it would feel like to be able to communicate more effectively. But there's things that they could do at home, right? Like, so a lot of times it's like being able to have like a check-in, whether that's like weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, where we're talking about like what went well, like what are things that I feel like you've been doing really well, that I've been feeling really appreciated by, or really loved or heard, whatever, and being able to voice that and really validate that in your partner. And also talking about like what didn't go well, like what are things that you did this week that, kind of did bother me, or I didn't really appreciate it. But when you're doing it in this check-in is supposed to be a space, the same way that therapy is, like this very neutral, safe space where we can talk about these things. We're in a headspace where we're expecting to be told certain things haven't been going well. We're also being validated for the things that have been going well. So when we're talking about them, we're in a much better headspace, right? Like it's clear and we know kind of what to expect. And that really helps to be able to talk about these things without it leading to a disagreement. Because what happens is if you're not having these check-ins up there, if you're never talking about like what came up for you, like we were mentioning earlier, you're avoiding it, right? Like, or it'll come up and you feel frustrated that something happened, but you're not saying it. So you'll be passive aggressive, or you'll just bottle it up, and then it'll sort of compound one on top of the other. And then when there's a disagreement, or when you feel like really fed up by something, it just comes out, but it comes out in a way that you didn't want it to, or that really creates a tear in the relationship, rather than when you're talking about it in this check-in, it feels like we're talking about it and I'm saying it in a way that I'm being very thoughtful, very mindful of how it's going to come across to you, that I'm being, gentle in the way that I'm saying it, because that's really important when you're talking about things that you don't like about your partner, that you want to be improved, being really gentle in the way that you say it, and starting it up, you're just saying it kind of however it comes out, and being very blaming. It makes it very hard for the other person to listen to you and to be able to reflect and understand you, because they're feeling attacked, or they're really personalizing it. So really being mindful of, like, when you're talking about things that could be hard to hear, just saying that, like, this might be really hard for you to hear, and I'm sorry about that, and I'm gonna try my best to say it in the best way that I can. But be mindful that I'm not trying to hurt you, right? Like, I just really want to say this because this is important to me. And being able to preface it in that way, I think, for a lot of times helps the other person to just kind of let their guard down a little bit and understand that, like, this is safe, right? Like, this isn't me attacking you. That's not the point of it. Like, I want us to be in a good space. And another thing when it comes to communicating and being able to feel on the same page is taking accountability. So being able to feel like if your partner says that you did something, and although your intention wasn't to be hurtful, that was what the outcome was, just taking accountability and saying, like, wow, like, I didn't realize that happened, or I didn't realize that me doing that created that experience for you. I'll be more mindful of that. Just being receptive to those things, and being really open to hearing them and wanting to do better and wanting to be there for your partner can go a really long way.
And saying sorry is one thing, but without action, it's just a word. Sorry is just, it's just a word made up of letters if there's nothing of substance to it, no real physical change.
That was great stuff. That was very beautiful. So, something for me that I've realized through marriage, and this is my longest relationship as well, love is a choice because I think, unfortunately, because of those rom coms that you and I love, Erica, and I think you do too, Stephanie, we are, as women, growing up with this idea of what love is. And I think it's very different from actually what it is because they're only showing the good parts of a relationship and not the parts that these people are going to be working through behind closed doors. So, a lot of the time, what I find now being a married woman and also having friends that are in long-term relationship and seeing people just get in relationship, all of that stuff, I'm finding that people are not expecting things to feel the way that they may feel. And, like the kind of easiness of what I find real love to be. It is a job in itself. And I find for couples is that they're willing to give up on it too easily. A lot of the time, they're not willing to work through problems. And I don't know if that's because, like we're saying, not acknowledging, right, that they have them in the beginning or whenever, and they just don't go to therapy or they don't talk and they don't communicate. So then it just becomes this huge explosion. But
I think
maybe
people chase the high, and because it's so normalized to, the big brass band, that's the feeling you should have all the time, 24/7. I mean, that's a part of a relationship, but love exists there in those quiet moments. And I think people are constantly chasing that high, that next fix, and it becomes a little bit of an addiction. And that's why you hop so easily to the next thing, because the minute that starts to dwindle down, you think something's wrong. Oh, I'm not in love anymore. I have to go find that somewhere else.
So do you find that, Erica, that people come to you at the end of that, as they put it, honeymoon phase, and they're like, we're not sure if this is working out anymore?
Yeah, where I find where they're coming in and they're feeling like, or just in general, where like, because what you guys are saying is absolutely right, where people do feel like, especially I think nowadays, they do, I feel like, give up maybe a little too easily, or they feel like when things start to get a little bit tough, or when they're going through these adjustment periods, they're having a hard time sort of seeing past the moment that they're in and recognizing that this is for right now. It's not going to be forever, and so they feel like, well, I'm not happy right now, right? Like, or things are really, really tough right now, or he's not getting me, and work is really demanding, and so we're not connecting, and so this must mean that we're not compatible, or this isn't working anymore, and they forget the reasons that they were brought together. They're missing those quiet moments that you guys are talking about, right? Like where their partner is still prioritizing them and they are still feeling connected to them in these other ways, but not in these like grand gesture ways that they are, I guess, like conditioned to feel that that's what's normalized and that's what a relationship is, when it's not. Like a relationship isn't about these like big moments. Of course those moments are important and they matter, but there's so much that's unseen in relationships and marriages that really make the relationship, right? Like, and that are tough, because you're right, marriage and relationship is such hard work. It takes so much out of you. It really has you facing like a lot of yourself, a lot of your trauma, and so much work behind it in terms of being able to make things work and connect with this other person. And it can feel really overwhelming and really draining in a lot of ways, especially when you're, focusing on work or like kids, like all these different things that are coming into place. It can feel like, you're right, like another job basically, to be with this other person and trying to make it work. And it can feel really exhausting, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worth it, right? Like that this relationship isn't worth it, because right now it feels like we're going through this hard period, or that we're working through it. A lot of times it's a matter of being able to look beyond that and recognize that, like, once we get through this hump, we are going to feel stronger, right? Like we are going to feel more connected afterwards. We're going to be in a much better space with it. And I think that that's important. That's really valuable. Before I got married, we went to couples therapy, me and my husband, to just like work out some kinks, like be able to talk through like what was going on. Because my engagement period, there was a time where it felt really like tension, like there was like a lot of fighting, and it was really overwhelming during that time period. So we went, and it was really comforting to hear the therapist say that this is normal, right? Like it's normal for you to be going through this period, and couples do this. Couples will go through this period after the honeymoon ends, where it will become like, okay, we're seeing each other now, like real life is setting in, and it is going to feel a little bit harder. But after you go through this hump, it's going to feel so good to be with this other person that you guys are in a much deeper space with each other. You know each other a lot more. So there's a deeper sense of like comfort and just like familiarity with each other that feels really good to be in that space with them. And so I held on to that, recognizing and knowing that, okay, like although we're in this space right now that feels really tough, once we get over this hump, it's going to feel so, so good. And it did. When you get over that hump and you're in this space where it feels like we're communicating so well, we're talking to each other, in a really nice way, we feel like we're prioritizing each other, like that feels amazing. And of course, like it ebbs and flows. That's what relationships are, because as people and as humans, we're ebbing and flowing, like we're growing and learning about ourselves and changing. And so there will always be these times in the relationship where that's happening within the relationship too, where like you're both changing, like you're both adjusting to each other. You both are sort of assessing and figuring out like, okay, this is where I'm at now, this is where you are now, this is where we used to be, but right now we're in this whole different space. We're figuring each other out again. Like, what does that look like? And it can feel hard during those periods of adjustment to sort of figure out and assess and kind of let go.
Yeah, so true. And, we mention that relationships are work. And what's the saying? If you love what you do, quote unquote, you'll never work a day in your life. It's true. If the love is really there, it's work, but there's not this big sense of heaviness to it. People forget, at the end of all of this, truly, you need to be with someone you consider a friend, somebody that you have that base with, and that you can say like a friend. Emily and I sometimes will get into scrap about stuff, and then it doesn't mean like our friendship is over.
If you don't watch Sex in the City, though, then it's over, Stephanie.
I know. I know that one. I'm on edge right now. But just, I think we put relationships and intimacy into this box of, if something goes awry or it's difficult or hard, then it's over. But you wouldn't think that of a friendship, but just a platonic friendship.
Or even family, right? Like when with like siblings or parents, right? Like they're oftentimes like even more difficult or harder to sort of navigate those relationships. But we never think, I'm not going to be with this person, or I'm never going to speak to them again, or I'm cutting them off. But I think that, and that's a mindset, right? Because like what makes it different when you're choosing to partner with this person and choosing to start a life with them, they are becoming your family essentially. But for some reason it's like a mindset where it's harder to sort of be able to feel like, okay, like we're going through these difficult times. It's really hard right now, but it doesn't have to mean that it'll feel this way forever, because we've gone through those time periods with like siblings, with parents, where it was a time period where it was very tough, it was very difficult to navigate, but we know that, and we were able to see like we've come to the other side of that, and things feel better now. We're able to feel more connected with them, whatever. But it's hard sometimes to sort of see that and feel like it's valid to be able to expect that and want that, and know that it's going to happen with a romantic relationship.
Yeah, I do think it's important to mention that abuse of any kind in relationships should never be allowed. What we are all speaking about is for a healthy relationship. And the minute that those signs, those red flags start to show up, don't try to put a band-aid over them saying, oh, well, we just have to talk about it more. It doesn't work that way. If somebody's showing you their colors and being abusive, get out. Walk away, love yourself enough to walk away. And if you can't, try to find, any sort of help that you can. I always feel that that's something I'm very passionate about, because I have been in that situation where these words that we're all speaking to one another and this advice, it's beautiful. But I used to listen to some of these podcasts and I would say, oh, well, that's all I need. That's the fix. That's going to fix everything. But the truth was, it was so much deeper than that. And it was just not a healthy relationship, period. And nothing I was going to do was going to change that, other than me saying, I'm done.
Yeah. And that's so important to know, because it's true. Like there are instances and times where, yeah, like it's not enough to just want to will yourself out of it and just be the only one sort of putting in the effort. And in those situations, right, like where there are red flags and it is abusive and you're not being treated, well, yeah, like there isn't any reason or excuse to sort of put up with it and try to overcome that and feel like it's going to get better, when that's not the case. So it was really important, yes, to be able to mention that and highlight that, because that's very true.
So a question that I have, Erica, because it's becoming such a thing, right? These gender roles and being gender normative and just fulfilling roles that, like in the 50s, there was 50s housewives and, women are still recovering from that. And look at where we are now. We have a woman in the White House, which is everything. That took decades though. So we're still learning every day. And so are the men. I have to put it out there that also the men need time to adjust and learn, because we're all learning new things every day. So how do you find gender roles are influencing a relationship, especially nowadays?
I think more and more it just depends on how traditional the person is, right? Like where the couple is. Because sometimes like there are individuals in the relationship where they don't mind some of the gender roles and they feel kind of like comforted by it. They feel like, well, that's one of my strengths and I really enjoy that. And if that's the case and it works for them, then it works for them. But then I've been seeing more and more like women kind of breaking some of those traditional gender roles and being able to voice and expect, right, like that childcare is shared, right, like and taking care of the home is shared. That those things are not shouldn't be expected of me in the same way that I'm not expecting you to be the sole breadwinner and for me to sort of stay home. And I've seen that in them being able to voice that, but the men are also receptive of it, right? Like and understanding and recognizing, like, of course that makes sense. If you're working as much as me and we made this house together and we both live in this house, like it makes sense that we're sharing in these responsibilities and it's unfair to sort of put it just on you. And I think like with everything else, it's a matter of just being able to talk through these things and understand what each of you want, what's expected of each other, and voicing them in a way that feels like, okay, this is what I want to bring to the table. This is what I want it to look like. This is how I want to share these responsibilities. How do you want it to look like? And how do you want to share these responsibilities? And being able to talk through that and come up with a plan that just works for the both of you. You might have grown up and saw that your parents did one thing and it felt like, that was oppressive or you didn't really like it as much. You felt like, I'm not going to do that. And now that you're in your own relationship and creating your own family, it makes sense to be able to talk about that and discuss, like, this is what I want it to look like, right? Like, this is what I saw and this is what I might have felt, used to, but I want it to be this way. What do you think? And being able to sort of meet each other and talk about it and come up with an arrangement that feels safe and comfortable for the both of you.
The idea of sharing the responsibilities like we were just talking about and it never being completely even. It's never going to be 50-50. It's just, unfortunately, somebody's going to pick up the slack and sometimes it's going to be 70-30. Sometimes it's going to be, 80-20. It should never be 100-0 unless that person's going through like turmoil or something. And it's those expectations again, right? They come rearing their ugly head that it has to be 50-50, but it really doesn't, because I know in my relationship, most of the time, I would say we're on the 60-40 and then maybe merging on the 70-30. I tend to carry the usual gender normative of what a female does in the house.
It's not always going to be 50-50, and oftentimes it's not. And I think it's a matter of also recognizing that it's not always going to feel either like 70-30 where you're taking up most of the Sunday. That sometimes there will be moments where it should balance out, right? Like where it might shift, or it'll look like in these different or these other areas, the other person is taking up more of the slack than you are, and you recognize like it's just playing off each other's strengths and what the other person enjoys more, what they're better at. Of course, like it's not this hard rule or this rigid rule where it feels like I'm always doing this thing. Like we can be flexible when it comes to that, but it's just recognizing like even though, let's say with the housework, like I'm the one who's taking more of the responsibility, in this other area, like it is more so you, like, and you are taking more of that. And so in that way, it feels like it balances itself out when we're looking at the relationship as a whole and all the responsibilities as a whole.
I guess it kind of brings us around to a circle. What would you say to your 15-year-old self?
If I could, I guess, talk to my 15-year-old self, I'd tell her to trust herself more in her gut, to be able to sort of hone in that skill of being able to like listen to myself rather than needing validation or like asking other people for what they think before making a decision, or just knowing that like what I decide is enough, right? Like, or what I think about it is enough. Because throughout life, I've had such a hard time being able to feel like me wanting to do something or me feeling like this was the choice for me was a good enough reason to just go out and do it. But I always felt like I needed to ask other people or get the validation. And as I've gotten older, I realized like it's not necessary, and it's just me sort of putting off or not trusting myself enough to feel like that what I decided and what I wanted to do was enough. Another thing is allowing myself to like be in the moment and enjoying my time in my life. I felt like growing up, I was very sheltered. My mom really like held on to us tight in terms of like what we were allowed to do, where we were allowed to go. So I feel like I would have maybe never rebelled, but just like allowed myself to sort of be more in the moment and enjoy certain things and stick up for myself a little bit more in that way. And to not let fear hold me back, right? Like to not let my fear or the worst case scenario sort of stop me from living life and enjoying life and doing things that at the time I felt like could have been really, really amazing for me.
Get out of my brain, Erica. I loved all of that. And I appreciate you so much for taking the time to come speak with us and all of the, young women and men and whoever may be listening. And hopefully there's a couple of little bits of help in there that might spark something in someone to reflect and to look inward and to say, you know what, I'm gonna be all right. I'm gonna make good decisions for myself and just I can't say thank you enough, Erica, for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you both. I really had such a great time being here, and I'm glad that you guys invited me.
Where can we find you? Where can anybody who's listening, who's super interested in getting connected with you on social, what are your socials?
So on my Instagram, it's Connection Counseling NY, and I put like tidbits on relationship advice, things to try. They can sign up for my newsletter there, where I'll send like guides and just like things to be able to try within your relationship for date nights and stuff like that.
And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you sync up with us next